Andreessen writes and directs Big Bad Wolf from 2006. And this one stars Richard Tyson. But you've also got a familiar name if you are a werewolf fan in David Norton, who also has a very small role in this. It is more of a cameo than anything else, but he is here. And Big Bad Wolf, yes, it's a werewolf movie, 2006, and it's broadly a similar story to kind of Rear Window or Fright Night to a degree. Not quite the same, but it reminds me of it. So let me just explain what the plot is here. So it focuses on a family. We've got the teenage son living at home with his mother, who is now married another guy. So he has a stepfather, and this stepfather was a friend of his father's who died some years before. And this young man begins to suspect that his stepfather is actually a werewolf after there is a werewolf attack in a cabin that he owns. And he begins to suspect that the stepfather could be a lycanthrope. And he and his kind of female love interest friend are kind of investigating, trying to figure out, is he a werewolf? And if he is, what they are going to do about it, because obviously this guy wants to protect his secret. So it kind of has that sort of, not a neighbour, but actually a family member in this case, can potentially being a killer in some way or another, very much like Rear Window or Fright Night. So there are differences. This one, obviously, this is not a neighbour. He's actually in the same house, and they kind of figure out relatively kind of quickly. So let's discuss what I think works in this movie's favour. So this is a film which is a little different to typical werewolf lore, which is both a good and a bad thing, but it makes it a little bit more unique. One key aspect here is the werewolf is actually able to talk whilst in werewolf form, and almost has a sort of its own separate personality, but is certainly able to communicate and function in a way that he'd be able to have a kind of conversation. So it makes it for a little bit of a different dynamic compared to many and most other werewolf films in that respect. I also kind of think the movie's structured quite differently to many other films, because the movie's kind of first act, we have like this prologue where we see initial werewolf attack that involves this young man's father, and then we have a kind of extended sort of first act sequence where we have these 6 teenagers go to this cabin who are inevitably attacked by a werewolf, and that's quite an extended sequence, which almost feels like a little movie in itself. And then the kind of the acts 2 and 3 are the kind of sneaking around, figuring out, is the stepfather or a werewolf or isn't he? And obviously dealing with the fallout of that. And that's kind of, so it has this kind of interesting sort of structure where it kind of is a 3-act structure, but at the same time the act 1 is so different and almost a story in its own right. It gives it a kind of unique feel in a way. The movie presents this werewolf as, again, a little different, but in not just the fact that he's talking. The werewolf is actually a bit of a sexual predator as well. In actual fact, he rapes in werewolf form more than one person, which makes him a particularly different threat in a way compared to your garden variety werewolves. And even in another sequence which doesn't involve a werewolf, someone has to try and get some evidence, and this involves a sexual act. So the movie has this quite hard sexual element to it. Whilst it's not explicit on screen, there is kind of like a wide shot where you see one sequence where the werewolf kind of raping someone, but it's nothing explicit. It still has the idea of it, which again is quite foreign in a werewolf film, but it does give this movie more stakes and make this werewolf feel more dangerous in some ways than just a beast, just a kind of a thing that wants to eat you. The fact that he has this sort of sexual side to him, and also the fact that he's got this kind of ability to communicate, and the werewolf as a character is kind of more like Freddy Krueger, who's kind of making these sort of quips and one-liners and things like that. So he kind of has a Freddy Krueger kind of vibe to him. The werewolf makeup or costume is a full body makeup, but he's kind of more wolfman than werewolf, if that makes sense. More of a kind of a snub-faced sort of look to him, but I don't think the makeup's bad, essentially. There is a reasonable amount of kind of gore shots, heads being ripped off and things like that. And there's actually quite a high body count in this film. The acting isn't bad. It's nothing to write home about. It's very kind of typical of a kind of a straight kind of DVD, as this was kind of movie of its time. It's not ever brilliant, but it's never distractingly bad either. I think it's fine. And it's a relatively kind of sort of well-paced film. And I think the movie, as plot-wise, has some interesting elements, although it misses, I think, some opportunities as well. And in some ways, in doing so, it makes the film unpredictable in its predictableness. Because you think something's going to happen. Oh, this is the way the story will go, because they've clearly got a twist, and they kind of don't. So you kind of almost are expecting it to go certain ways, and when it doesn't, you think, oh, okay, the movie's more basic than I kind of thought in some respects. But because we've been conditioned to think, oh, there's going to be some kind of other reveal, when there isn't, that in itself is almost a surprise. I'm not going to give anything away necessarily, but you know, there it is. So what doesn't work? I mean, let me just come back to that point. The reveal of the werewolf, I think, could have been played out to, you know, are they, aren't they, a little bit better? Because I think the reveal is very early on about whether the stepdad is or isn't a werewolf, or is there another werewolf or something around. And I won't spell it out, but it's kind of early on, which deflates the sort of the tension that kind of could have been built up, because you could have had, you know, evidence which is suggesting it, but also there might be evidence to suggest that it potentially isn't. But they don't do that. They kind of give you a definitive answer, one way or the other. And that, to me, it may have been a little bit obvious to a degree, but at the same time, I think it would have kept you engaged a little more, because the answers are given to you pretty early on. One aspect of the, I mean, it's not, I'm not giving away spoilers, but it's probably fairly obvious about, you know, that particular plot element. But one thing I didn't really understand is, okay, so we've got this kind of werewolf which has the ability to communicate, but he has this kind of quippy, Freddy Krueger-esque kind of style personality, whilst the werewolf in his human form doesn't have that, and is actually probably more morose and aggressive in his banter, in his candour with other people than he is in the werewolf form, whilst he's way more jokey. Which, I don't know, it struck me as a little bit of an odd choice, and something that isn't kind of ever sort of referenced, why his personality seems to be so different in a werewolf form. It's almost sort of suggesting that the werewolf keeps his wits about him and kind of like is able to think whilst in wolf form, but at the same time the way he communicates is so different compared to how the werewolf in human form communicates with other people without the kind of the quips and the jokes. So that to me was a little jarring. The other problem is, I mean, whether you accept a talking werewolf or not is one thing, right? I'm not going to judge the movie good or bad because of that, because that's the decision that they want to go with. Fine, you know, I can accept it in this reality, but the execution is this werewolf is talking through a werewolf mask, and really how his words being able to be pronounced when, you know, his kind of lips are constantly snarled, and, you know, there's not a lot of like articulation in the kind of the mouth and stuff. So it looks like someone's talking through a mask. So the illusion is a little kind of like on the weaker side in kind of regards to that. There are some kind of extra bodies that sort of turn up, extra kind of like red shirts that are there purely to kind of get kind of like torn through. And you're thinking, okay, you know, we haven't built up characters, and they're clearly there just to kind of like up the body count, which is, you know, fine. There's some cool kind of, you know, kill scenes and things, but they're just okay. We want to have kill scenes, but we want our main characters to have plot armor. So there's kind of like you know, somewhat of a little bit of a disconnect with that. I think the whole, again, trying to be vague here, the whole setup of how the stepfather is involved with the mother, and then the kind of the deceased father, and also the deceased father's brother, so this kid's uncle. It just, again, needed a little bit more fleshing out to me. I felt that there was backstory that's kind of just given to you in a kind of a few lines of dialogue, but again, not quite enough is done with it. The other thing to mention, the last thing, is the transformation sequences are done through morphing technology, which was kind of like the thing in the early 2000s. You know, this was the sort of technology that had come out with CGI morphing from one thing to another, and it looks terrible. It looked terrible then, and it looks terrible now. So the transformation sequences aren't great. Overall, though, I think I still kind of quite enjoyed this movie, and I think some of its unconventional choices, although I think are flawed, I think make this movie interesting in a way. And despite the fact that this movie is ultimately not as clever as it could have been, you almost are fooled into kind of thinking it's going to be more clever, and therefore it becomes a little bit surprising when it isn't. So, there you go. I'll give this movie a 6 out of 10. It's a fun watch. It's an uncomplicated watch. As I say, maybe the kind of the werewolf rape scenes might be a little bit too much for some, but whatever. It's like some odd choices here. 6 out of 10. Have you seen this film? What did you think? Leave me a comment and I'll look forward to seeing you next time.